I'm Ethan Wong, and today I'm here with Ekiwah Adler-Belendez. He was born in Amatlan, Morelos in 1987. He is a bilingual and bicultural poet, speaker, and teacher. Author of 6 poetry books, his work has been presented in universities, festivals, and literary forums in Mexico, the United States, Germany, Hungary, and Canada. He edited the book Acto de Presencia, Anthology of Young Poets with Disabilities. His latest poetry book, Amor sobre Ruedas, or Love on Wheels, published by Editorial 17, explores the intersections between disability activism, poetry, eros, fatherhood, and the joy and challenges of using a wheelchair. In 2019, he won the award granted by the British Council and the PADAM to produce The Surprising Disappearance of Maria Inmaculada, a documentary podcast exploring the lives of 2 married women in wheelchairs fighting for their rights. He is also the recipient of the 2019 George Garrett Award for Distinguished Poetry Teaching. He is passionate about reading poetry in spaces where poetry and love for literature usually have no voice, such as prisons, low-income schools, public hospitals, and special education schools. He is the proud father of Lucio Valentin, his 6-year-old son.
Thank you very much, Ethan. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, we'll get straight into the questions then.
Sure.
So I think a question that I've asked every poet that I've talked to so far, because I think it's useful to get the same or get different perspectives on the same issue, which is, how did you first find out you wanted to write poetry?
Yes, that is a mysterious question, how it comes. But in my case, I was 10, and at 10 years old, I was starting to get familiar with email. And in those early days of emails, you would get these massive forwards. And my mom got one, and she just said, "This is a nice quote. I'm going to just read it out loud to Ekiwah." And the quote was actually a poem by Rumi, Jalaluddin Rumi. And it said, "The doctor said, take these pills." And I took these pills. The doctor said, "Drink this tea." And I drank this tea. And then the doctor said, "Get rid of the sweet wine from the beloved's lips." And I said, "It's time to say goodbye to the doctor." And when I heard that at 10 years old, it produced this thrill in me, because I was always fascinated by words. And I could feel in that poem by Jalaluddin Rumi, the 13th century mystic from Iran, that he was getting drunk off of words. And in that ecstatic experience that can come when you're talking with somebody for hours and hours, or listening to music at dawn, as those poets did, or whirling in circles, or in ecstatic lovemaking, I could feel him getting high off of that. And I quickly learned that he wasn't talking about literal wine, because in Islam and in that time, for someone really religious, wine is strictly forbidden. So he was talking about another kind of wine that comes from being close to the beloved, whatever that beloved is in the moment and for everyone. And I thought, that is what I want to do. What's interesting to me is that I found over the years of asking people the same question that you're interested in asking, how have you gotten into poetry, that it's usually one poet or one poet that gets the entire ball started, and then we read beyond that poet. And we can actually also see some of the weaknesses of just writing in that one particular style. But it gets the train rolling. And so one of the fantasies that I would have to get people started on poetry is just put them in a huge poetry library, tell them to walk in, whether it's virtual or not, and find whatever spark is going to light them.
Yeah, I think that's definitely correct. And I think it's just being able to find a single poem or a single line even that you read it and then you identify with or you feel it. And once you feel the poetry, I think everything else comes after that, definitely.
And also, I've asked people, do you write poetry? What's interesting to me about that is that in the beginning, a lot of times the response that I get is no, but it's usually not a dry no. It's a no that's then accompanied with, no, I don't write poetry, but there are these things in my notebooks that I don't have any clue how to name. And they are usually poetry of some form or another in some tradition. And the reason why those poems aren't categorized as poetry is maybe that particular person has this mental image of what poetry is supposed to be. It's supposed to rhyme, or it's supposed to be lyrical or abstract or narrative or whatever that fixed image is. What's so beautiful about poetry is that there are so many genres, so many styles, so many poetic traditions, that the minute that you have a doubt of whether it's straight narrative or not, it's probably already poetry.
Yeah, I think that's definitely correct. And with that in mind, I'd want to ask a follow-up, which is with all of these different broad spectrums of what poetry can be, then what do you think, as you have developed your own style over the years, what do you think poetry has become specifically for you?
I'm still looking for that. I'm still looking and finding that wine of getting ecstatic and getting high on words. The beauty of the image for me of a wine that doesn't actually get you drunk is that then it also forces me to think about that balance between getting really high and also staying aware, because I'm not actually drunk. So can I hold that ecstasy, that expanded state, that delirium, also openness to all kinds of feelings, sensations, and at the same time be a present father and poetry teacher and friend, and bring all of that into my poetry? I would say that's still the quest after all these years. One of the other things that I discovered, so I began with that search of wanting to reach ecstatic spaces through poetry. And then I also discovered poets like Tony Hoagland, and his poetry is charged with irony, and it's charged with the irony of being human, saying at any moment in time, I can fuck up and make a mistake, and I can allow for those fuck ups and that self-critical voice to also come into my poetry. And reading that, his poems were a big breakthrough for me, because I realized that along with that ecstatic voice, I could really show my own vulnerabilities and my own flaws on the page. So I want to just read you a brief Tony Hoagland poem that we have here. Let me just find it. Candlelight. By Tony Hoagland. Crossing the porch in the hazy dusk to worship the moon rising like a yellow filling station on the black horizon. You feel the faint grit of ants beneath your shoes, but you keep walking, because in this world you have to decide what you are willing to kill. Saving your marriage might mean dinner for two by candlelight on steak, raised on pasture, chopped out of rainforests, whose absence might mean an atmospheric thinness 50 years from now, above the vulnerable head of your bald grandson on vacation, as the cells of his scalp are sauteed by solar radiation, break down like suspects under questioning. Still you slice the sirloin into pieces and feed each other on silver forks under the approving gaze of the waiter whose purchased attention and French name are a kind of candlelight in themselves, while in the background, the fingertips of the pianist float over the tusks of the slaughtered elephant without a care, as if the elephant had granted its permission. I'm going to just read that last little bit. Still you slice the sirloin steak into pieces and feed each other on silver forks under the approving gaze of a waiter whose purchased attention and French name are a kind of candlelight themselves, while in the background, the fingertips of the pianist float over the tusks of the slaughtered elephant without a care, as if the elephant had granted its permission.
Thank you. That was
And I love how much you can feel the romance of the scene, the candlelight dinner. It could be a very idyllic scene, and yet he's reminding us of that other face. You have to decide what you're willing to kill. And, you know, here's the slaughtered cow, here are the ivory tusks of the piano. Really, what price are we willing to pay as we walk through life?
Yeah, definitely. And actually stemming off that, I wanted to ask, with this perspective I've heard you give about the intoxication of being by a beloved, or about this kind of romantic poem, what do you think is the role of love poems now in a contemporary setting, when we have technically passed, say, the official romantic period or romantic era?
I think it's never too late for love.
Yeah.
That's what comes to mind. That love is one of those old sentiments that in some form or another has been there since eternity, or one could argue that there are social constructs that are involved, manifestations that change costumes for it that are different. Joy is a very old thing. I love a quote by John Berger that says that sorrows and tragedies, they come up, the sorrows and tragedies of modern world or of other times come up with 1,000 new disguises for existing, but happiness has always been the same old happiness. I tend to agree with that. One of the difficulties that I came across when writing love poems, or that I still come across, is the temptation of being too general. The sense of falling in love for somebody just sweeps across me, and some of that particularity is lost because I'm in that state of infatuation. I find myself falling for some of the cliches that I myself try and avoid in that state. And what has really helped me there has been to try and get past my own desire for the person and notice something very particular about the other person that I think no other person has. In that moment, I know I'm really watching the other person and stepping out of the, hopefully, the cliche zone. That is also a kind of metaphor for what we need to do in love in general. We start having that, or what I need to do, let me speak in first person. We start having that feeling well up inside, but then who is really the other person that is staring back at me? What is it that I really notice about them, with some of the things that may be difficult about the other person, or strange, or baffling? The poem of A Silken Tent, where Robert Frost describes a lover as a silken tent. Maybe we can find that and read that at some point, or just have it as another type of activity. But to think that a beloved can be a silken tent and compare the whole poem to that, it takes kind of boldness.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you said, I also resonate with. It's a very difficult thing, I think, to write about emotions very close to you, because you get very caught up in describing them in a very certain way, so much so that you get detached from what you are actually writing, for me at least. I wanted to ask additionally that, so we've been talking a little bit about how you write. So what would you say is generally the kinds of poems or the content of the poems that you end up writing?
One of the things that's changed for me over the years is that in the beginning, I would just write individual poems. And so those poems would change very much according to the mood that I was in, what I was experiencing at that particular time period. And as soon as I made it more of a habit to sit down and write, I began to notice that one poem started to talk to another poem, and so I was no longer writing in isolation, but also thinking about the entire book and what that was trying to say. And in the entire book is the possibility of going on some sort of journey, although I don't want to be too premeditated about it, because if I start out saying it will be a book that will have these many poems, and the character or the persona will go from this point in the beginning of this book, of the book, to this other point, that may be putting a stronghold on it too quickly. And what may come out in those type of situations is that I'm sort of forcing a book. More likely what happens to me is I look through my poems and I begin to notice there are all these poems where the subject of wings is coming up. So then I might say, oh, the subject of wings is coming up, so I might want to write about what it feels like to fly, and what are the difficulties of flying, and where have other friends talked about that, or other poets. Suddenly it starts singing. In that sense, my latest book is Love on Wheels. And what that book tries to come to grips with is my wheelchair, because in all of my other books, I hadn't really acknowledged that. That was in my bio. But I was very resistant to acknowledging that because I didn't want to be labeled as a poet with disability, to the point where people stopped listening to what I was saying. So I would never mention my wheelchair. It was all inspired by the natural world around me in this very beautiful place that I live, Amatlan de Quetzalcoatl in Mexico. Also, I was wanting to get published, and I had a literary agent at a young age, and she sent out my poetry manuscript to all of these poetry editors, and they wrote back saying, there's great presentation here. He has a way with the audience, but this is not mature enough to get published. And I was 16, and that was a big blow for my ego at the time and my puffed up feathers. So I told my agent at the time, please introduce me to somebody that can really teach me how to revise my work, because I've taken poetry classes here and there, but it all seems very tangential. Why don't you revise this line, revise that line? But that's not really showing me enough what I have to do. And she put me in touch with this very wild teacher from Indianapolis that believes, as I've come to believe, that there is a way in which one's line breaks, and the way that where one pauses really leads you into the emotion of the poem, the feeling behind it, and what needs to be revised. And he started listening that all my poems were spoken out like this: the sky provides room for the moon to move, the moon for my eye to linger, and this for me to ponder on the privilege of invisible and visible sight. And he stopped me and said, all that is really interesting, but the problem with your poems now is that you are disembodying yourself because you're afraid to embrace your body, and you can feel that in the way that you're saying them. You're not using your human voice. It's some other spiritual voice that is throwing itself way out there, but it isn't your human voice. Why don't you write poems about your wheelchair? And as soon as I dipped down into that, I realized that I had a tremendous amount of sexual desire that was bottled up, and a tremendous amount of fear that because of my wheelchair, I would never be sexually free. And that journey produced Love on Wheels. And you can feel how in the first poems, I'm in my basically sophomore year of college. And by the last poems, I'm writing to my 3-year-old son at the time.
Yeah.
The whole process took 9 years to write. And not just 9 years where I was all the time focused on revision, but 9 years in which I was also waiting for certain things to happen in some way to be able to write those poems. And I remember feeling like at the time that I was 13, 14, 17, there was this huge pressure that I felt internally to get my work out there, to publish, to receive approval. And I think that that is very important too. I decided to self-publish my work early, and that self-publication gave me a chance to share it and put it out there in a way that maybe not doing that might not have. But I've also come to really learn the value of letting things mature and letting time do its work and revising heavily.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you said is very important, especially because I definitely understand and relate to a lot of what you said too, even down to the being impatient to get my work out there at an earlier age. I know I definitely was, and that's ended up being why I self-published a collection. So I totally understand everything, and I'm sure I can apply your advice to myself as well about letting things mature and eventually getting there.
I think also magazines are a great platform, because what sending out your poems to magazines, what they eventually taught me is also to have more spaciousness in terms of the critique, because certain magazines can reject your work, and then one magazine says, yes, I want you. So you realize it's very important to take into account what others think of your poetry, grow from that as much as possible, but also learning to be the own judge of your poetry at the end of the day. At the same time, when you start submitting to poetry magazines regularly, you get desensitized to rejection, which can be a very empowering thing, because you 90% of the time, because of the way that magazines work, they will send that rejection slip. At the same time, if you start getting to a point where your work starts getting accepted in more magazines, it's also a nice way to track your progress, to ask yourself, is this ready to be sent out yet, or should I give it one more view? I also find from talking to people that a lot of times it's not so much the question of how to get started, because as I've mentioned before, people more often than not do write poetry. Even those that say that they don't are secretly writing poetry in their closet at some point of their life. It's more that fear of how do I handle rejection if it comes, or is this really good enough to be poetry? Or maybe it's so good that I don't want to change a single word. I was more in that category, and so I had to let my ego puff down quite a bit to continue that learning.
Yeah. Do you want to read one or two of your own poems before we about close out?
Sure. Let's see. Walking with another body. Walking became a cement running track, the color of the grass in a dry spell. To exercise, I walk stiff and slack, waiting for a miracle to make me well. One leg in a brace, heavy and straight, the other two loose and swiveling ahead. I pushed my walker with a pirate's gait. Exercise to learn to walk, everyone said. Over and over the same plot of land, the sense of moving but in the same place. Now our 3-year-old son holding my hand tugs at it softly, adjusting his pace. As I in my wheelchair spin by his side, this too is walking, love moving in time. Our son bounces with a jaunty pit-bat walk to a barely musical chinelo song. He learns to dance before he can talk, jiggling his shoulders and head forward and back. He grins at gravity, toys as they fall from the great heights of boxes with a crash. He picks them up and again they stand tall. There's a secret joy in heroes that thrash. Batman himself slips and tumbles. Now the mask is off. It's our son screaming. His mother lifts him in her arms as he cries and mumbles. She rocks him and suddenly he's half laughing and dreaming. To walk is to fly and fall on the ground, to let tears and laughter take on their sound. Beneath her white dress, a secret word billows as we hold each other's hands in bed. Her crow-black hair gossips on the pillow, some squawking news my fingertips have read. This too is walking, to be firmly erect, so I find vertical walking too lame. Stubbornly horizontal, I object. This life is not a petty marching game. We learn to move with ever-growing speed, in every racing heartbeat and caress. Faster than stepping feet, we spawn and seed. This kind of walk requires great finesse. There's more to this walking than moving feet. It is a delicate place where lovers meet.
Thank you for the poem. Do you have any closing words before we end it out? Anything else you want to say or self-promote?
I think that the process that I went through with accepting my wheelchair is wider than just me as a person with a disability coming to grips with that. I think that we all have parts of ourselves that we're a little bit ashamed of or scared to talk about, as the previous very beautiful interview already mentioned. But I think that in those things that we're a little bit embarrassed about, a little bit afraid of, and in the journey of coming to grips with whatever that is in our lives, is often a very, very juicy territory to write. because those vulnerabilities are also the things that separate us from others. They separate us because it's a uniqueness in our own story and journey, but they also join us to others because we've all felt joy, despair, anger, that whole range. I also think that a myth that is constantly inspiring when I think about the process of revising poetry is actually the written old version of Beauty and the Beast in whatever it forms. I like to think of it as a metaphor for the process of revision, where that sublime beauty, that delicateness dances with the beastliness, the ugly, what is also strange. I think you can think of that trio of Beauty and the Beast as many different oppositions of light and darkness that can merge with each other in revision to give the poem more volume and depth. You could say, for instance, ethereal language on one side and very coarse, plain language on the other side, or whatever feels like it's representing the energy of light in your poem, contrasted with that dark hidden force, what is quote unquote ugly, kissing what you find beautiful. There's all that, you can go on and on and on, you know, feminine, masculine, but not to categorize those in very strict and purely heteronormative terms, but just thinking about the balance of those two forces in a poem and the moment that they kiss each other and embrace each other.
All right. Thank you so much.